Do you see a clear strategy or policy thinking in Trump's making up of his own cabinet?
Well, so far what we've seen is real loyalty. He's gone with Jeff Sessions, who was his closest ally in Congress for Attorney General, one of the core positions, and he's picked people he's very comfortable with for the security positions, Representative Pompeo and General Flynn. And so I think at this point we can say that they're all hardliners in their own way, but we can't say the whole administration is going to be hardline because we haven't seen the rest of the cabinet. We do know that these people are very strongly against Islam, radical Islam. That's the clear thing we can see, and immigration.
What's your take, Professor Hagle?
I think I would generally agree with that. I'm not sure that I would necessarily characterize it so much as a hardliner, that term gets thrown around an awful lot. Certainly there's going to be a move to the right from the Obama administration, but that's not hardly surprising.
What's your take, Mr. Schweitzer?
Well, the reality of governing and running a campaign and even the transition are very, very different things. And we're in a situation now where people that have not had the reins of power and have been out there taking various positions are about to have the reins of power, and that changes a lot. They have their ideology, but once they're confronted with the reality of governing, I think we'll see a little bit of a more realistic approach to doing the actual job.
So, Professor Dunham, can you sense some trend in policy making for the Trump administration? For example, Senator Jeff Sessions will become his Attorney General, and he supports limiting legal immigration, arguing it protects American jobs. So will the immigration policy of the U.S. Go to some kind of extremes?
Well, I think enforcement will change. What you have to realize is that the executive branch of the U.S. government can't unilaterally set policy, and it has to follow the laws and the appropriations of Congress. President Obama, during his term, used executive power to liberalize a lot in terms of immigration, protecting people who were in the country illegally, but also President Obama deported more people than any recent president. So I think what we will see is more of a crackdown on people in the country illegally, but President Trump alone cannot change immigration policy radically.
But we know that the Republican Party is now in control of both Senate and Congress. So, Mr. Schweitzer, do you think it's much easier for President-elect Trump to get things done?
Well, he'll have the reins of power in the executive branch, and yes, he's got a somewhat friendly Congress, but the fact that they're all of one party isn't the end of the analysis. First of all, the Democrats in the Senate still have tremendous power, and I do not think that is going to change. And second of all, there are many people in Congress that are in the Republican Party that bring different perspectives to an issue like immigration. So the notion that because everyone is of one party, they're just going to rubber stamp, that Congress will just rubber stamp the president-elect's policies once he's in office is not the case. And I think we'll see a lot of debate and discussion about the right places to end up on issues like immigration.
Well, Professor Hagle, let's talk about Mr. Michael Flynn, the new National Security Advisor. He believes the U.S. is losing a global war against Islamist extremism that may last for generations. What does this mean for the U.S. strategy of war on terror?
Well, it probably means, and no surprise here, that we're going to get tougher, at least in the eyes of Flynn and some others, Donald Trump, that think that we haven't been as forceful in terms of prosecuting the war on terrorism. Now, how that's going to actually manifest itself is an open question. Many people think that Flynn is, as was described earlier, a hardliner, or you can use some other term. But my guess is that there are going to be other people that are going to be part of the decision-making process. And Trump may see Flynn as a truth teller in the sense that, look, here there really is a problem, we need to address it. But in terms of how that actually occurs, in terms of the practical aspects to it, that I think that, and this is where even members of Congress may come into play here in terms of appropriations and so forth, that it won't be that it'll be some horrific or drastic change, but it'll certainly be something that will allow, at least on its face, it appear that the United States is more serious about the war on terror than at least Republicans thought that President Obama was.
So, Professor Dunham, will Michael Flynn's, the thinking of Michael Flynn have repercussions on the U.S. domestic policies in the near future? Because in his campaign, Donald Trump said that he endorses extreme vetting for some immigrants. So now we take his campaign words more seriously.
Well, usually the National Security Advisor doesn't have much to do with domestic policy, but in this case I think it is possible because of what you were saying, extreme vetting, because there are some people in the Trump orbit who would want some sort of either registration or knowing of Muslims or potential threats in the U.S. I think concerning what Professor Hagle was saying, I think it'll be interesting to see if there's a balance between these people who are more hawkish and the State Department. I mean, the talk of Mitt Romney as a potential Secretary of State versus a Rudy Giuliani, who has also been very critical of the Obama administration on war on terror. I think it'll be really interesting to see if he picks someone who's more diplomatic or someone who is just as outspoken as General Flynn to be the Secretary of State.
Yeah, talking about balancing, earlier you mentioned that he already picked someone from loyalty, but there's also another part he must appeal to, that is those in the Republican Party who didn't endorse him during his campaign. So do you think he's considering Mitt Romney as a candidate for Secretary of State is appealing to those people?
I think at least the imagery is that he wants to appeal to them. He wants to reach out. We don't know if he is seriously considering him. Sometimes when I watch President-elect Trump, I think that we're still in a reality TV show, and he wants to get people on the set so that he can fire everybody but one of them. So we just don't know. We as analysts were so wrong so often this year that I don't know whether Mitt Romney is being seriously considered or whether it's imagery there. We know that Vice President-elect Pence has said that he's being considered, but again, I will start believing that we're having this outreach when some of these people who are not in the inner orbit are selected, are announced instead of just being thrown out there as potential candidates.
What's your take, Mr. Schweitzer?
Well, I think it depends what post they're in. So state, for example, under recent administrations has been kind of marginalized here in Washington as far as being an important power broker. You know, when Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State under Barack Obama, it was important that she was Secretary of State in terms of running the bureaucracy, but the power center was the White House, not the State Department. When Colin Powell was the Secretary of State under President Bush, the center of power was the White House and not the State Department. So I think in some ways, yes, it's helpful to have a more appealing, superficially appealing kind of traditional establishment figure in that kind of a job. But if the power center remains at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue and they're not really included in the process, it can actually be counterproductive.
Well, Professor Hagle, do you think President-elect Donald Trump will reach out to Democrats?
Oh, I think he will. Basically, one of his selling points was that he's a deal maker and that he can get along with people. And to a certain extent, we've already seen that occurring as he reached out to people. He complimented Hillary Clinton and saying he's good people and so forth. So he's sort of reaching out. Now, again, that could be superficial. We don't know what's going to happen. And to follow up on some earlier comments, one of the things that really is the case is when, as I heard someone else phrase it, the rhetoric meets the reality. And I think that we're starting to see that, and perhaps Trump is starting to see that in the sense that he said, okay, well, look, this was okay for the campaign and maybe a little bit of the transition, if you want to think of it as a reality show, but you know, at a certain point, you're going to have to govern. Now, the question is as to what extent Donald Trump is willing to delegate, that he seems to like to do that a fair amount, hire the best people, let them take care of it. But if, as was suggested in some previous administrations, that the center of power was still in the White House, well, then it's a little bit more concerning, I suppose, for people that see people like General Flynn that are part of the decision-making process if he's got President Trump's ear.
So, Professor Dunham, what kind of positions do you think Donald Trump will offer to the Democrats? Would they be symbolic or more concrete positions?
No, I would suspect that we'll see several Democrats in the Trump administration. And yes, you're right that across party lines, generally Democrats have hired Republicans to be defense secretary. Republicans have hired Democrats to be transportation secretary or others that are on the periphery of power. But I think right now, some of those secondary positions, President Trump is thinking of people not from a partisan standpoint, but people who would go along with his plans. I wouldn't be surprised if the person he picks for transportation is a Democrat because infrastructure is so important to him, and that's one where Democrats agree with him more than Republicans. But I've heard a wide range from of positions where Democrats are being considered.
And this is also a president-elect who advertised 4,000 job vacancies on the internet. So yes. Talking about his policy toward China, do you sense a more conservative or even hostile way?
I don't think we can talk conservative, liberal, left, right. I think he is much more hawkish. Well, hawkish is the wrong word again, but on trade, he's more aggressive. And I do think that, I mean, you have to go by what he said in the campaign, which is that he believes that there should be a 35 or 45% tariff on Chinese goods as as at least the first bargaining point. In terms of military, I think a lot of it depends on the relationship with Russia. That if he and Putin and President Xi Jinping work together, it could be good for China. If Donald Trump is less active in the South China Sea than President Obama, it could be good for China. But if President Trump gets upset about trade and somebody's tweet in China makes him mad, then I think that the sparks could fly.
What's your take, Mr. Schweitzer?
We need to see how he's going to do this job generally. You know, this notion of tweeting is obviously something that everybody's talking about. And when you're president of the United States, every single word you say matters. It reverberates around the world. And I don't think we know yet, because I don't think he knows yet, how he's going to do this job. He's going to have to figure it out. I've been through multiple presidential transitions, and in every case, it takes months, once you have the reins of power, to get your footing and figure out how to do the job. You know, in general, he won because he appealed to people in terms of his willingness to challenge institutions, institutions around the world, institutions in the United States, and I think we'll continue to see some of that. He's got to figure out how to do the job.
What's your take, Professor Hagle?
I think one of the things we always have to remember about Donald Trump is that he basically is, again, the deal maker, but also a showman to a certain extent. And part of his negotiating tactic is to talk tough, talk big, and then come back from that position when you actually get to the bargaining table. So even though we need to take seriously what he said on the campaign trail, you also have to take it with a grain of salt in the sense that that's not necessarily where he's going to end up in his final position. Basically, he wants to have fair trade, for example, and so, but is willing to still continue the trade. He doesn't want to shut ourselves off, so he's not an isolationist in that sense. And also in terms of, it's correct that people rely or look at very closely anything a president says, but on the other hand, people have to realize that this is Donald Trump, and he has to adjust his behavior, but to a certain extent, perhaps we have to adjust ours too, and take, again, a lot of things that he says with a grain of salt. But we have to wait and see how he ends up being president as opposed to how he was the candidate.
Well, Professor Dunham, you mentioned some aggressive remarks in Trump's campaign toward China. So when he's actually in office, do you think he will continue Barack Obama's pivot to Asia strategy or rebalancing China in the Asia Pacific?
I think you'll see him. One thing he has talked about is that America shouldn't be everywhere in the world. And I could see him pivoting away from President Obama's pivot to Asia. I think when it comes to China, one of the most important things will be who he names as ambassador to China as a signal.
And Secretary of State.
No, I'm saying as ambassador to China. Right. It's being written about in Iowa that Governor Terry Branstad, who knows China very well and has engaged in trade with China, might consider being ambassador to China. If he names someone like that, I think that's sending a signal as to what's the priority. If he names a political friend of his or a business friend, it sends another priority.
But what about trade, as you mentioned?
Yeah, I think we have to judge him by what he does. I agree with Professor Hagle that what he did is the first bargaining chip to be really tough. And the question is the end game. And I think he wants to cut a deal, but he wants to cut a good deal for the U.S. with China. I think harder is going to be Japan and South Korea, where he has said we want more money from them or else we might move out our troops. That's a tougher negotiation because that's geopolitical. With China, it's almost pure economics, and both sides don't want to lose. So there is room for both of them to try to figure out a win-win solution.